you're good to go.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Eve. I'm the Director of Community Relations for the Streammate Network, and I'm also here on behalf of Elevate. I'm here today with Madison Zack-Wu of Strippers Are Workers. Madison is the campaign manager for Strippers Are Workers, and she is also Elevate's December 2023 community partner. Madison, thank you so much for being here, and it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me about your earlier years leading up to the time before you became a dancer?
I think I was always someone who was kind of going my own way, potentially to a fault. And um, so I had like a lot of creativity and energy and was just trying to figure out like where I fit into the world. And one of the things following up to me starting dancing was I dropped out of high school when I was 14 and was moving into the world with 3 months of high school education. And then from there, trying to get back into it maybe. And then that didn't work. And I would go do something else. And then I would maybe try to get more schooling done. That wouldn't work. And during that time, I would also be working jobs. And these jobs were minimum wage to maybe like slightly above minimum wage. And by the time I was 18, I was needing to find my own place to live by myself and self-support. And so having realized like, okay, these minimum wage jobs are going to be really tough to live off of. I probably should go back to school, but also working 40 hours a week and going to school at the same time is incredibly difficult. And I also had like some anxiety about how well I could stick with a job, that I did have to show up for and I couldn't be late or I couldn't call out. There were so many days where like I was just like, man, everything is so overwhelming. And so I really wanted something that could help me go to school and help me pay all of my bills without working a ton. And also like give me the flexibility to sometimes like not have to show up when I don't have capacity to. And so that's when I realized that stripping might be the job that helps me accomplish those things.
Did you already know someone that was working in the strip clubs here in Seattle at the time?
Kind of. So I didn't have anyone close to me that was a dancer. I had always been kind of fringe in my own way. I was very comfortable like dancing and comfortable in my body. And so I was thinking that like I would be potentially a good fit for the industry, but I didn't know who to reach out to. I knew one girl who was currently dancing and I had just like kind of known her through school, was still friends with her on Facebook. And I reached out to her and I was like, hey, can I take you out to coffee? And like ask you questions about this. And I was trying really hard to be like smart about it and to find out like what I could potentially be getting into. And to be completely honest, I don't think that she did a very good job at preparing me, and
You were around 18.
yeah, I was 18. Yeah, I was a couple months after my 18th birthday. And she did recommend a couple clubs for me to check out. And so actually like that evening, after the afternoon of getting coffee with her, like we drove up to Seattle and I went into a couple clubs and ended up getting an audition scheduled for the later that week at one of the clubs. And then I was just scheduled.
And just like that. So
Yeah.
tell me about those initial experiences then in the club as a brand new dancer. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like some novelty and excitement about it. I'm sure that you know new dancer energy, like new dancer energy sells super well. I think that it felt good to know that I was working towards my goal of being able to pay rent and pay all my bills. I knew that in a couple months I would be able to go back to school. But also like it's really daunting, right? Like being 18 and doing that transition of doing like the adult things and like finding my rhythm while also like navigating this industry where it's really easy to be alienated from mentors, right? Like some of the older dancers, I think here, especially in Seattle, aren't necessarily there to like bring you under their wing and like show you the ropes. So, for example, my main training in the club was like from my first club manager, who's like a middle-aged man, you know? And so I think there was some like challenge going into the industry being like someone coming from my background, still figuring out who I am, what feels right for me, what I need, also just trying to navigate life. Um, and then some of the only guidance I was getting was from a manager.
So, in terms of the interaction then with customers, what was that like for you getting acclimated to, especially the conversational aspect? Because I think people tend to overlook that part a lot about dancing
Yeah,
conversation.
you're so right. It was really funny because I had some background in dance, like hip hop and ballet. And so when I auditioned at the club, I told the manager, like, I can dance. And he looked at me and he was like, I truly do not care how well you can dance. It does not matter.
Yeah.
I only care how you can talk to other people and how you can talk to customers. So, like, absolutely, so true. It's really about communication and like building relationships. I think that dancing at 18, coming from a sense of instability in my life, instability in my home life, I think that I was very unsure of myself. I didn't quite know what communication meant. I wasn't quite sure how to navigate this like complex dynamic of it being like transactional human relationship and communication and like making space for a customer, making them feel like good about themselves and confident, and also, monetizing that in some sort of way and being like smart about it. How you make this into something that's like sustainable financially while also like setting boundaries and like what even are my boundaries and this whole like adventure. And I think that that's like such a amazing and also like really deep pool to be thrown into as like a young woman and also just like someone who's getting started in the world.
Absolutely. Not to mention, there is typically an age disparity with a lot of the people that you tend to interact with. So, how did that, you know, how did that work out for you? And what did you learn about yourself in the process in terms of communication with these customers?
Yeah, there is definitely like a power differential there. I think that the age disparity, the like reality of being young and probably like needing the job. I think there's certain people that can sense that, and there's kind of this onus as sex workers, strippers, whoever you are, that like you should be in control of like how you set boundaries and how you communicate. And I think that while many customers are amazing, there's some customers that come in who don't feel like they have to be doing that work for you, of like, is this okay, or like, am I going to really see you and see what works for you right now? And so I think having all that burden put on myself as an individual is just like um it was extremely intense, but like I learned so much, and I went into this job not really knowing how to feel in my body, like what my experience was and what felt good and what didn't feel good, let alone feeling it, how to actually cognitively recognize it. And then, let alone cognitively recognize it, I didn't know how to verbalize it and communicate it. And beyond that, I didn't know how to communicate it in a way that was still like effective for maintaining relationships and still continuing to make money and like maintain this co-created dynamic with a customer. And I really learned how to set boundaries and like speak up for myself and to like recognize my own needs because of that dynamic. And I'm very grateful for that.
So, the first night or the first few nights that you worked and bringing home cash money at the end of the night, do you remember how that felt and what did you do? What was the first things that you did?
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. I have like a really vivid memory of counting like thousands of dollars on the table after like having worked for a little bit, and my grandmother seeing the money and she was like, "What is that?" And I was like, "It's just the money that I'm making right now." And the first thing I did was I started buying things for my new home, for my apartment. It was like dishes from Target and curtains. um, yeah, it was nothing crazy. I didn't go out and spend all this money on like anything wild. I was just really excited to make my own space, and I started saving. And um, yeah, I think I just had a sense of stability. I wasn't really having to overthink things too much of like, okay, how much do I have to put towards this bill specifically? And then how much do I have left over for these bills? Like I did feel like whatever I need to pay for, I can pay for. And that was really nice in the process of getting to develop my skills of like responsibility.
There's a lot of allure for sure, especially being able to take home and see, but also take home money at the end of the night. So let's just say, hypothetically, I'm a brand new dancer here in Washington State. What can I expect going in for the evening as a dancer? Go ahead and set the scene for me.
I think hopefully you make a couple friends. You know, there's hopefully some older, longtime dancers there that are like, oh, like it's your first night or it's your first week, like welcome. And maybe they take you under your wing a little bit. Maybe they give you a lap dance. They start giving you a little bit of tips, you know. Um, and and then you go on stage and you're very nervous and you're probably dancing way too fast. And the secret to like good stripping is to dance way slower than you think you need to. Um, and then you just start talking to people and you start learning what it is these customers even want to talk to you about. Maybe there's some awkwardness and then you're like, okay, maybe I need to learn how to find some more flow here. And honestly, I think it's just a really fun experience of being thrown in and just learning as you go.
So let's go over some of the different kind of things that are maybe overlooked whenever you are deciding, okay, I'm going to become a dancer. Particularly in the state of Washington, what are some of the different ways that dancers can not only generate money within the clubs, but also what are some of the fees that are associated, that they can expect to be associated when they are working within those club environments?
When you work, there's like a few different ways here to make your money. So there's obviously stages, but Washington and like Seattle is notoriously not really a stage performance city.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a bit of a running joke that you can usually tell who's from out of town because they're the ones tipping your stage. So most of our money isn't coming from stage performances here. We utilize stage performances as a way to like read the room. Rather than like make money, it's more of like the beginning of us starting to make sales. And then from there, we make money either through lap dances or private rooms. And in both of those settings, it's really about, you know, either dancing or communication, like building relationships. The main difference is just lap dances are usually sold by the dance, and then private rooms are attractive for a lot of people because it's obviously more private and intimate, and also there's not this pressure of being like counting every single dance. And so there's a little bit more of like an intimacy and flow to that. So those are the general ways that dancers can make money. There's quite a few fees here in Washington. It's pretty standard to have house fees in strip clubs across the nation.
I think so.
Yeah, but I think what really sets Washington apart is our house fees are a lot higher. So for example, if you go down and dance in Portland right now, your house fee could be as low as $20, usually like more around 40, $50. Here, the average house fee for dancers is $150.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay. Just thinking back on just my own personal time as a dancer, I remember that the house fees would increase as the night got further in. So if maybe you show up at 7, it's maybe closer to $25. But if you show up at like 10, 11, then you're getting closer to like $100 by that point.
Mhm.
So how is there like a gauge on how much you're going to pay for your house fees?
Yeah, some clubs do have a slight modification depending on time, and it really just varies club by club. But I think usually the lowest it ever gets here is 60, and that's like on the really low end. It's very easily over $100 every night when you're showing up at like normal night shift time, like 8 p.m., 9 p.m. So,
Wow, is there a difference between even day and night shift then?
yeah, sometimes day shift is a little bit cheaper. There's a couple clubs that I think will do if you show up at like 11:30 a.m. or you'll get some pretty cheap rent, but for the most part, it's pretty expensive no matter which shift you're working. And that's just the start. There's a lot of other fees here. So unsurprisingly, they'll take cuts of private rooms. So, you know, maybe 30%-ish of a private room. Some clubs do take cuts out of dances. I think what's interesting about Seattle is there's a lot of other fees here that you're not going to be finding in other states and cities. So, for example, dancers will have to sell like a minimum amount of soda drinks a night. And if they don't sell those soda drinks, they have to pay out the difference. Or some clubs have a fee to like leave the club on through the front door on your shift. If you want to like go next door to the restaurant or the bar, go out to your car, they'll charge you like $20 or something. So there's a lot of like little fees that start getting added on just as like a way for clubs to start making more money.
Is there any formality around those additional fees outside of the house fees? Like, would people just know that, like, if they wanted to leave to go next door real quick, has that already been established? Is that a widely known thing, or does it seem to just be more sporadic?
Yeah, I think a lot of the fees are pretty haphazardly enforced, which is really unfortunate because it allows management to discriminate against dancers. So there's definitely disparate enforcement where certain dancers might not be charged those fees, but some dancers might be charged those fees really consistently. And it can be used as a form of retaliation, and maybe it's just because like a particular manager doesn't like you, or we see a lot of dancers of color, particularly black dancers, are the ones getting charged those fees the most. Maybe there's drama, or maybe like you're not tipping out enough or something like that, and so now you start seeing those fees more. Certainly it's a game here to play, to be on the good side of your manager in order to like not experience some of that retaliation or those increase of fees. And even, for example, you can work a whole night, be going on stage, which benefits the club and is still putting on a performance for the customers that are coming in and paying the club cover. And then you could make, say, $100, but rent is $150. And you can pay that club all of the money that you made, that $100, and go home with nothing. And sometimes there's good managers that will give you cuts, but part of the game is like being on the good side of the manager, so they will kind of cut you some slack, and they're like, oh, it's okay, you can give me like $50 tonight, or it's okay, don't worry about it, you don't have to pay tonight. It's all so inconsistent because there's really like no standard of practice, and there's no like enforcement, so it's really up to the club's discretion.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it's very standardized at all, even per club that is determining their own fees and rules and how they run things, just from what I'm hearing. Going back to house fees, why do you think that the fees are particularly excessive compared to maybe other states where they do have like a thriving strip club industry?
Yeah. Here in Washington, we're the only state to have a complete alcohol prohibition in strip clubs. So in the other 49 states, strip clubs are allowed to serve alcohol, depending on some details. Like maybe in Kentucky, you have to bring your own beer, which is very odd. Yeah, it's very strange. Or some clubs, if it's full nude, it's a juice bar. But if it's a titty bar, basically there is alcohol. Oregon, for example, you can have nudity, alcohol together, all those things. But ultimately, regardless of the variation, every other state has alcohol service. Washington's the only one without alcohol service. And what that means is that there's very few revenue sources for clubs. There's cover, which used to be about $15. It's
For customers.
for customers, which goes to the clubs. It's rising now to the point where people are turning away. For example, the downtown club has a $35 cover.
Whoa.
Yeah. I actually went out for my birthday with some friends, and we were trying to go to the club, and like we went up there and they were like, yeah, it's $35 a person. And we are like, sorry, like we love it and we just can't justify that. But I digress. There's cover fee, there's ATM charges, there's credit card charges, and then like soda drink sales. But other than that, the only other money stream that clubs have is from dancer fees. And that's because they can't sell alcohol, which alcohol is usually a very good revenue generator. Beyond that, of like alcohol being a direct revenue source, also alcohol tends to bring in people. So like here in Washington, if you want to go into a strip club, like you go in, you pay your cover, and you sit down, You realize it's dry. You probably didn't know that. And then you go to the bar and you're like, hey, can I get a beer? And they're like, sorry, we only have Coke. And then you're like, okay, that's kind of weird. And you go and sit down, and um, stages aren't the way that dancers are making a lot of their money. So a lot of dancers have wonderful stages, but maybe like that's not the center of like what the effort's going into. And so you're like sitting here, and then you realize other people aren't coming in. The club's generally empty because other people are like, oh, there's a high cover, or there's like no alcohol, we don't want to go in. And what ultimately happens is that the clubs are just dead and there's no customers. So then clubs in response have to keep raising dancers' fees. And so dancer fees will be really, really high, but then they're working a shift where only like 10 or 20 people are coming in an 8-hour span when there's, 15 to 60 different dancers working on the floor that night. It's just not very sustainable.
There sounds like whenever those rules or those laws were determined, there was a bit of oversight on the impacts that it would essentially have within those clubs and within for the patrons even, but also for the dancers.
The unintended consequences of that regulation is that it ends up marginalizing, in this case, like dancers themselves, and actually leaves them without protections, without rights. And so when it creates an industry that's not sustainable or hard to access or hard to disseminate resources in, not like culturally normalized, and instead it's stigmatized, all of those effects end up directly affecting dancers. And I don't think that was necessarily intended when people were making those regulations, but that is the reality of the consequences of those regulations.
You mentioned that it can be dead, but also like promotion. So maybe encouraging people for themed nights. Do you see a lot of effort or energy being put into bringing more people into the clubs so that they aren't necessarily having to rely so much on those house fees and those fees to make their money?
I don't. It's really strange. I talk to so many dancers every week as a part of my job, and I have heard so consistently across the board, there's a few dancers who will go out of their way and be like, the money here is not good. I will put in effort to create marketing materials, or I will create like an event that's themed. And they'll bring it to management and be like, hey, I have these ideas. I will do some of this work. Or they'll go to management and say, please, like, I think it would really benefit us all to change the sign, or to maybe like do some marketing here or something. So many dancers are proposing this idea, and then they all come to me and say like they just won't do it. They won't put effort into it. And ultimately a club, we've only had 13 clubs in Washington as of last summer, and one of them just shut down. And that was one of the clubs where we had a dancer who was approaching management saying like, hey, can we do some promotion? And they don't. And I'm not entirely sure why. I think partially it's because right now they can benefit from just increasing fees. And I think that that's just kind of their business strategy right now.
Kind of the fallback. So it's not even necessarily, from what I'm gathering anyways, lack of resources. It's just this kind of mentality from how things have just been done in the past and not necessarily evolving.
Yeah, and I think it is because they already have an old system that works. And I think partially it is also because resources are limited. It's my understanding that clubs are like really struggling to stay open, which is really scary because we have so many workers, like dancers, and then also staff that are being employed and financially supported by these jobs. And so the possibility of the few clubs that we have in Washington shutting down is like really scary.
Let's talk about SAW. Strippers are workers. So what is SAW?
So SAW is a really cool grassroots labor movement of Washington state dancers who are leading their own way. We really deeply believe that like we have the informed experiences to know what the industry needs. And so we've come together as this massive community of Washington dancers, and we fight for ways to change the industry. And our main objective is legislative policy, but we also try to change our industry by creating community, by creating resources and education for dancers, by doing community outreach to non-sex worker spaces and talk to them about sex worker rights and destigmatizing the industry. There's such a large spectrum of our work, but our main objective is to really tackle some of those harmful regulations that are leaving us without basic healthy working environments. Our group started, as a lot of grassroots orgs start, as just a few dancers in the locker room coming together and being like, man, management is really not treating us well. This was when back rent, which is a form of indebting dancers to the club. So if you go and work a shift, you owe that $150 of rent, but you don't make any money. The club would actually track that and call it back rent, and then say you actually now have a balance that you owe us that you will have to pay as you continue to work here. So back rent was really prevalent at this time. Management forcing dancers to tip out, a lot of like racism, all these things still happen now, because nothing has really meaningfully changed. But while those things were happening in around 2016, a few dancers were just getting together in a locker room. Like, we need to start going public to this. Like, we should go to labor and industries and file complaints. We should go to media. And we should just like start pushing back. And it was really dancers saying like, hey, doesn't this feel wrong? Like, doesn't this feel like we're being treated poorly? And shouldn't we do something about it? And so they started kind of making waves a little bit. And then in 2018, a small group of dancers approached Working Washington, which is a workers' rights org here in Washington. And they asked for formal organizing support. And so Working Washington said yes. And then they started doing formal organizing, which is like reach out at clubs and teaching dancers how to talk to others. And
How was that received by the clubs whenever they learned that people were doing outreach, or this group was doing outreach?
yeah, we've had multiple instances of retaliation, especially in the earlier days when some of those original dancers were starting to organize and speak out. They were actually retaliated against really explicitly. With background, clubs just have their own like tracking system. And so clubs called up two of these original dancers who had just started to go public and said, hey, you have $5,000 of back rent and you need to pay it to us in 3 days. And these dancers don't recall ever actually creating a balance of back rent. And when they asked for proof of like how this back rent was accumulated, the clubs couldn't supply it and all of this stuff. So there's been multiple instances of retaliation. I think as our organization has gotten larger, we've gotten a little bit more protection because it's a little bit easier to say like, well, we are explicitly associated with this group that is explicitly doing work to fight against poor club practices. And so if I can show that when I spoke at this hearing, X amount of time after that hearing, I was then, fired or something like that. It's a little bit easier. I think we have a lot more security now, but especially in the early days of organizing, there wasn't much security for being like organizing workers.
Yeah. But how else are you supposed to do outreach other than in the clubs? Because it's not like, or I mean, maybe I'm just making assumptions here, but it's not like typically we have connections to our coworkers as dancers outside of the club setting a lot of the time.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. I think that this industry, yes, you're working with coworkers and you might have a couple friends here and there. You'll have someone that you'll have chats with while you're working, but it's still a little bit isolated and distant. And it's not like you're going to be running into each other outside of the club.
Right.
So organizing absolutely has to happen in the club. And I think it starts with building relationships and then it turns into something more. Like you might know, one of your fellow dancers might say like, man, this customer just walked out on $200 worth of dances and management like didn't do anything to try to get my money back and also told me that it was my fault that that happened. And you hear your fellow dancer say that and you're like, man, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Like I actually experienced something similar with this other manager. And I think those sort of conversations about talking about what's wrong starts bringing people together, because part of the isolation of experiencing lack of rights in any sort of way, it's like really normalized and internalized, and it kind of feels like it's just happening to you. And it's just like, it doesn't feel that big of a deal or that real. But once you start hearing other people talk about it or they approach you, then you start to be like, oh man, like, yeah, this is a big deal. And yeah, like I don't want that to happen to you, which means that I don't want that happening to myself. And organizing takes off from there. And then we can also, now we can get a lot more formal about organizing, and we can actually like teach our dancers how to talk about these issues and how to bring up these issues. Or we do field trips into clubs and we say hello to everyone and we throw money and like hand out stickers and stuff. So I think in any sort of unionizing, organizing grassroots movement, it always starts with like small conversations, and then it starts getting like a lot more practical.
Absolutely. Do you feel like among at least the Seattle clubs in particular, there's recognition like of your group whenever you walk in and they know that you're there to support?
I think that's finally starting to happen. It's really exciting. Certainly don't think every dancer is aware of us, unfortunately. But the last couple field trips that we've done, multiple dancers had approached the group and been like, yeah, like I've heard about y'all and like I really like what you're doing and I kind of want to get involved. So I think finally we're starting to get like critical mass, and I'm really excited about that.
That's awesome. That's awesome that you can do it in person too. That really makes a big difference between just, seeing a website online and but actually being able to reach out and connect with people in
Yeah.
person.
Especially just like the healing that happens with community and the empowerment that happens with community. Um, it's one thing to hear people like make blog posts on a website talking about like we deserve workers' rights and like we care. It's a whole nother like sit down with someone who has like a shared experience as you, and to like really feel seen and to really feel heard and to realize that you have like common struggle that you can work towards. And so I think in person is really vital. And that's why I'm really happy that we're a couple years away from the pandemic lockdown, at least, because clubs here were shut down for a whole year and our organizing had totally halted during the pandemic. And it wasn't until about 2 years ago now that our organizing was able to pick back up again. And so I think that's why we're starting to see a lot more momentum being built, because we're in person, we're organizing again, and now we're just like growing so much.
So what are SAW's objectives and what is your group hoping to accomplish?
So I think we have like a really high level few goals of like, how do we destigmatize this industry? How do we keep it sustainable for dancers and make sure that it's accessible and also like financially lucrative? And most importantly, like, how do we make it safe? So we try to accomplish those goals through this wide variety of tools. Primarily, right now, we are wanting to pass legislation to change all of the regulations that prevent us from having basic rights. So ultimately, we want to start capping all these really high fees. We want to make sure that there's minimum security and safety standards in clubs, because unsurprisingly, clubs are cutting corners on security here, and it's something that like we really deserve to have. And we want minimum training for club staff and for dancers, like access to resources. All these things we can legislate, but ultimately those things do cost money, and we can't generate money to fund those things without bringing in another revenue source, which is why we are also trying to end the alcohol prohibition, which ultimately is not even putting alcohol in clubs, because alcohol already exists in clubs here. People are able to binge drink in their cars before going into the club, or go to the bar next door and then come in. So we're not even putting alcohol in the clubs. We're like actually finding a way to regulate alcohol in the clubs. And once we do that, we want to make this an industry that really focuses on like the artistry of dancers and their talent, and like bringing in people who are like excited to see strippers doing stripper things. And with that, we're really hoping to see like massive overhaul changes to the industry.
So you were one of 14 people who testified this past March in front of the House Committee of Labor and Workplace in Olympia in support of SB 5614. Can you tell me more about what 5614 would do to improve working conditions for Washington state dancers?
Yeah. Yeah, ultimately this bill will give dancers more agency, more support, more security and safety, and that will allow us to do our jobs freely and to do our jobs without the complications of being in like financially extractive relationships with clubs, or the complications of not knowing if we can even pay our bills with this job. Ultimately, it will just make us be able to do this work with the fundamental rights that we deserve.
Going back to, your earlier point about standardizing, this would essentially help to kind of make things a little more black and white, not just for the clubs, but for the dancers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really like about our legislation is it creates a standard for clubs to have all fees, all different services to be mapped out in the contracts and then equal for every single dancer and then also equally enforced for every single dancer. So there would be a lot less room to start discriminating against workers.
So what has the general response been from clubs in particular whenever SB 5614 was proposed initially? Have you had a lot of collaboration with the club owners? And do they see value in what you're doing?
So the club owners, while we were going through multiple hearings with the bill, never fully supported the bill. When you're testifying or showing support or opinion on a bill, rather, you can either oppose it, you can support it, or you can be neutral. And the clubs were very consistently always neutral.
Whenever you were developing this bill, I believe I read that you worked with Senator Rebecca Saldana on it initially. Was there collaboration on the club's end in particular when developing some of these points within the bill?
Yeah, I think that, for example, Senator Saldana is like a really wonderful person who values consensus with stakeholders, which is wonderful. We were having an experience of clubs very vaguely saying that they theoretically like this idea of the bill and they care about dancers, but they're just not too sure about the implementation of things. And they would never like specifically call out one issue, but they generally have pushed back on like the fee caps and explicitly negotiated the terms of like security staffing. One thing that our group is asking for is a minimum of one security staff on site at all time, and clubs have negotiated that down. And so my impression is that the club owners will come to the table, and they have been coming to the table. And sometimes we do try to hear them out and be like, okay, like in what way is this practically difficult for you to execute on, or what's your justification for this thing? And a part of the process of creating a bill and then eventually passing the bill is to include all the stakeholders. But ultimately, I do think that fundamentally this bill has come from a workers' movement and will always be like a worker-centric bill. And innately, there will be conflicts between workers and management.
So, in an article published in The Stranger here in Seattle, Representative Sharon Wiley, who is also a co-chair for the Regulated Substance and Gaming Committee, quote, expressed concern about human trafficking in strip clubs, though she didn't explain how alcohol would exacerbate the issue. Also in the article, another representative, Tina Orwell, also appeared to have concerns about human trafficking in clubs as well. As our industry has previously seen, consensual sex work is often conflated with human trafficking by those who have no or limited experience working in sex work or contact with others who work in sex work. So, what are your thoughts about Representative Wiley and Orwell's concerns on this matter?
I think this is a very complicated question. Ultimately, when we're talking about issues of anti-trafficking, anti-violence, women's rights, the people who are engaged on these issues are coming from like authentically good places of wanting to protect people. And so like I want to recognize that Representative Wiley, Representative Orwell are very well intended. But I think ultimately when we're dealing with an industry that is deeply stigmatized and there's so much prejudice around it, there's a lot of like misunderstanding, like you said, about how those issues of violence and trafficking are showing up and how those things can be minimized or increased. And so people are generally, from my understanding, drawing conclusions that if you put alcohol into clubs, it'll make things more violent. People will be inhibited and poor behavior will happen. And there'll be like it'll be like this crazy thing. And in reality, like when you bring in like a larger population of the community and society, that has a lot of implicit controls where it starts modifying behavior. And when you bring in all of this agency oversight, like the Liquor Control Board having to monitor the business, you suddenly have more protection there. When you have more revenue to have security and to have security mechanisms like better lighting and better cameras, that creates more safety. And ultimately, one of the core determining factors of vulnerability for trafficking is financial instability. And so when we talk about alcohol, it is deeply increasing workers' rights by giving dancers financial stability and also creating all these other safety nets. There's a misconception that this work is innately harmful and innately going to cause violence. And I and many people that I trust and many studies around the world really deeply disagree with that. The work is not innately harmful or violent. The way that society stigmatizes the work in such a way that the workers themselves do not have basic rights is what increases the risk for harm. And so when we start making sure that dancers have basic fundamental workers' rights and have agency and autonomy in their work and have financial stability and are able to access resources and community in a way where they're not isolated and shunned, that's how we minimize trafficking and that's how we minimize violence.
SAW will be reintroducing SB 5614 during the next legislative session early next year. So what is SAW's plan going into the next round of sessions, and how are you feeling about it at this point?
Yeah, we are basically taking last year's bill draft, we're reworking it, we're trying to make it stronger, and then we're going to be introducing it under a different bill name because it will be slightly different. And so we'll actually be introducing what's called a companion bill. So we'll be introducing the new bill in the Senate and also the new bill in the House. That way we can run two bills simultaneously, which is also double the work, but I think we'll get through it. I'm feeling really confident that as we have continued drafting this bill language over the summer, that we're getting closer and closer to really dialing in what we want. And as we continue to lobby legislators, have conversations with them about what this bill is, why it's important, why it works, that is how we build power and legitimacy around this issue. Another strategy that we're utilizing is like really bringing in larger organizations to support our policy. And so we have like amazing Washington-based organizations and some national organizations that are involved in sex work community, are involved in anti-trafficking, anti-violence, women's rights, bodily autonomy, all these things. Some like really amazing people who have done tons of analysis and work, and they're coming in and saying like, yes, this policy is effective. We're also just continuing to ramp up our organizing, and like our numbers of dancers connected with SAW have just like continued to grow. And these are all the things that are needed to pass policy. With that said, I don't feel totally confident because this is an uphill battle. It's a sex work issue that's extremely stigmatized. It's like slightly controversial because it's talking about substance, it's talking about dancer conduct, it's talking about workers' rights for people that some members of our community don't really think deserve workers' rights. And the opposition that comes out around these issues tend to be like very strong. We're a very easy group to ignore. We're a very easy group to discredit. Unfortunately, something that I have been experiencing is the sense that like dancers' experiences will never be seen as credible, and that we have to have other people who are like experts who are not actually sex workers or strippers themselves to come in and say like, yes, these people know what's up. And so because of all of that, and because of last year, our bill was killed. You know, we did everything right. We passed through the Senate 40-8, which is really strong and bipartisan support. We passed through a House Labor Committee. And from there, we should have moved on to rules and then the floor of like for the rest of the House. But we actually got pulled into a second House committee, which is really uncommon. It's not really like a very standard practice. And then we weren't scheduled for hearing, which means that the bill is effectively killed. It can't move forward. there's a lot of things outside of our control. And so we're all doing our best, and we all deeply like believe in this and also deeply hope that this will pass because we so desperately need it. And so I feel really, really moved and like vulnerable and deeply hopeful because like I believe in this so much. The dancers that I'm organizing with believe in this so much. And also there's no guarantee, you know, we could still be living in a political climate and a socio-political climate that just like isn't ready for these things.
It's interesting what you said, because a resounding sentiment that I've seen and heard by sex workers, particularly when it comes to addressing issues that are negatively impacting them or their community, is that they feel that they are not taken seriously. Working in a political setting, especially, and persuading others who may have their own personal biases and stigmas against certain groups like sex workers to make fundamental changes that would help to improve their lives. How have you overcome this?
Yeah, I certainly do have conversations with people who are clearly like putting me down in some sort of way. You know, I get messaging that my experience isn't valid because I haven't sworn off stripping and the sex work industry as a whole, or I get like microaggressions that like, oh wow, like you seem smarter than I would expect, or more well-spoken than I would expect, or all these things, right? Like the whole spectrum of like, oh, you're a racial minority woman stripper, and like, how are you here, sort of thing. Also, be on top of that, this messages of like, do you really know what you're talking about, and like, or are you just like a silly stripper? And that's very real. One thing that I really enjoy about lobbying is that it's kind of like talking to strip club clients. You know, the whole part of talking to customers is like finding common ground, right? We have so many different types of people come through the club, and you might not have a lot of surface level similarities to them, but like as a stripper, it's your job to find ways to connect and find ways to create intimacy. And that really helps me in talking to legislators in opposition, because like I know that there is common ground. I know that we're all coming to these discussions with interests in like well-being, hopefully, and interests in like solving problems. And there's some things that we can usually agree on. And so that helps me feel a little bit less powerless, because I see ways that we can actually make these conversations work. I think the only times that it is too overwhelming for me is when I feel that those people who hold that stigma and prejudice against me and like my group are people with power that like we cannot move, because at that point we can't make change. But I think most of the time I stay optimistic that like that's not the case. There's always campaign and organizing tools and strategies to utilize. There's always relationships to build. There's always other perspectives to bring in. And so with that, I just try to remember that even if this policy doesn't pass this year, we're shifting this needle by having these conversations with people and kind of planting seeds of information or planting seeds of empathy. And I know that with that, we're changing things, even if it's like just a little bit, like hearts and minds. And so that keeps me feeling like the work has good purpose. And also I'm very aware that prejudice and stigma doesn't have to do with like who I am. It's very much just like other people's backgrounds and the things that they're coming to the table with. And so I try to just distance myself from that a little bit.
Well, Madison, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. And I wish you the best, all the best for you and SAW's endeavors coming up in the next year. If people want to learn more about Strippers Are Workers, they can go to strippersareworkers.org or follow them on social media at at Strippers Are Workers WA. Thanks.
Thank you for having me. This was so nice.